Unlike my last several flights, this book was right on time. Welcome into I Hate Reading, an ongoing audio and video podcast where I, Justin, help you, audience, decide whether or not you should read this book. And this week on tap is The Men We Need by Brant Hansen. And as I said, this book was right on time for me. I actually read this last summer and have been kind of skimming through and rereading parts of it over the last month or so. I really enjoyed this book, and I want to help you decide if it's the right book for you. Now, when I review these books, I'm looking at 4 different areas. I'm looking at the overall theme of the book. I'm looking at the book's readability. How easy is it actually to read? Again, from someone who hates reading. I'm also looking at the relatability of the book. How relatable is this to the normal person, to an everyday person? And finally, I'm looking at the actionability of the book. Can I take what I just read and go put it into practice? Let's not waste any time. Let's get into The Men We Need by Brant Hansen. The theme. Now, the overall theme of this book really talks about what it is to be a man in today's world. And even though it talks about what it is to be a man in today's world, I think it really applies to everybody, as it's really a good description of what it is to be a good person in today's world. But to be a man in today's world, what you typically think of when you think of a man, it evokes certain stereotypical thoughts of muscle-bound dudes or athletes or famous movie stars or, James Bond suave type people. And it's very easy to see how guys can get caught up in that and kind of lost in the striving for those types of things which have previously defined cool or manly for men. And oftentimes you find yourself thinking, hey, for my wife, am I supposed to be, Thor or James Bond here for my wife? Am I supposed to be bulging muscles and Mr. Take Charge and in control kind of guy? Or does being a man mean something different? And this book's theme does a really good job of evolving what that definition is. And one of the key points that the author talks about is being the keeper of the garden. What does that mean, to be keeper of the garden? Well, the author defines it as taking care of the vulnerable, taking responsibility, being dependable, being the person that we are supposed to be. He brings up a great point that says we cannot help others in those areas if we don't first take care of ourselves. So how can we expect to be a keeper of the garden if us ourselves are not kept up as well? And I want to go back to what he hit on of taking care of the vulnerable and taking responsibility, as those are definitions of masculinity and what it is to be a man today. And I think that's just great when you think about what it is to be a responsible person, to be a leader, to be a helpful person, taking responsibility, taking care of those who need it. And it's not just as simple as going through the motions of doing the necessary chores around the house or picking your kids up from school or whatever. But are you really there? Are you really pouring in yourself and discipleship and all of that to the people around you that need it, that want to grow from it, and that in turn can help you continue to grow? Readability. I finally figured out why I don't like reading books. And it started when I was in grade school and middle school and high school. And all of the books that I read were books that had discussions and dialogue between characters. And I found it tedious to have to read, "Oh no," gasped Fred. "But yes," exclaimed Mary. And just reading those exchanges and having to read all of that drove me nuts. But one thing I always did love about reading was things that were very conversational in tone, which is why I loved as a kid reading Sports Illustrated for Kids, if you can remember that, and why I still love reading articles on aggregated sites or apps or even in magazines, or God forbid a newspaper shows up at somebody's house. But I really liked the readability of this book because it was very conversational in tone. It was very casual, but it was also very difficult to read, but not in the way you might think. It was difficult because a lot of the points that the author hit on, at least for me, they kind of hit home, and I'm squirming in my chair a little bit, and I'm kind of not wanting to face the reality of some of my behavior over the last couple of years that this book calls out. But it does so in not an accusatory tone. It does it in a very kind of practical and reasonable and conversational way of just saying, hey, you might want to take a look in the mirror. If you're doing this kind of stuff, you're probably not living the life that you're supposed to. And one great point that he brings up, the author, is he says something to the effect of, if you continue to focus on meaningless things, you're going to feel a sense of meaningless in your life. For example, when he refers to sin, he says that we typically think of sinning as something on a list of do nots, but it's actually much more subtle. It's a slow replacement from good things with something quite deadly. And it stops you from being who you're supposed to be, but it does it slowly and subtly over time. Over time, the little micro choices that you make add up, and all of a sudden you look back 2 years from now, and you are a lesser version of yourself because you've allowed those things to creep in. Another example he talks about is if you, which I have felt this myself, if you struggle to find meaning in your life, it could be because you're focused on meaningless things. And for example, if someone is struggling to find meaning in their life, but their day-to-day is filled with video games and binge eating and pornography and gambling and whatever, then it's going to be hard for you to feel a life of meaning and a purpose because you haven't made room for anything that gives you meaning or purpose. Again, something that hit home for me pretty hard and made me kind of reevaluate how I was spending my time and what the hell I'm doing with my day. He also talks about an example of being angry. If you're angry at something, you're typically not angry just then and there. You have chosen to become angry at all these small little decisions that add up over time, and then it finally blows up into what we define as anger. But typically, if you rewind the clock, you'll see that there's a series of choices that we made as individuals that led us to that point. Again, that compounding effect, and that is something that really hit home for me. And I can see that with my marriage or family or work, where if you don't speak up, if you don't have the conversation on the front end, resentment can build and build and build. And then all of a sudden, it can explode into something that is really profound and big and messy when it didn't have to. So again, for the readability of the book, I think it's very casual, conversational, very easy to read as far as flip through the pages, but it might be difficult to read because it's going to force you to confront some things about yourself, as it did for me. And that left me squirming in my chair, feeling uncomfortable, wanting to put the book down and go do something else. But if you're willing to power through it, I think there's some real valuable lessons to learn. Relatability. As far as the idea of, is this book relatable? Again, just like the readability, I found it very relatable and something that all of us can recognize and see in our lives on a daily basis. One example the author talked about was discussing how for us men, our wife is the most important flower in our garden, and our job is to help her bloom. But not in the, I'm the man of the house and let me make you do all the good stuff and provide all the things and you stay at home. But if we are present as men and focused on meaningful things and working to grow and take responsibility, that is the water and food our wives need to grow. They need to be able to look over at us and see reliable and steady and dependable and present. And that for me might be the most important part of the book, is the idea of we need to be able to help our wives grow and bloom and become the best version of themselves. And the way that we do that is by them being able to rely on us so their energy can be spent on growing themselves, not having to remind us 10 times to do the thing or to spend time or whatever it is. The author talks about how as parents, it is not our job to make our kids marketable to the corporate world and teach them skills. Yes, we're going to do some of that, of course, but our main job is to shape their character. Our job is to mold them into good people. And as a parent, if we are present, truly present, there will be peace in our home. Again, this is a really good point about being present and being there with your children. We all get sidetracked. I'm as guilty as the next person of looking at my phone when my daughter's trying to talk to me or whatever. But whenever I catch myself doing that, I really try to stop, put my phone down, and fully engage with my daughter. And I notice, and my wife does too, that when the three of us spend less time on our devices and more time together with whatever it is, playing with Play-Doh, coloring, going up for a hike, just laughing, whatever. When that happens, we find that there is more peace in the home, that everybody's in a better mood, everybody is doing more of what they should be doing, everybody sleeps better, and it really is amazing how just something like that can have such a major impact. The author talks about how a great starting point for this is having real commitments to real people. Not just people, but real, authentic people who are not afraid to hold you accountable. That is why the ideas of fantasies are so appealing. We can live there without having to take responsibility for our actions. That is a really powerful sentence. We can live in the fantasy, and that's why it's so appealing, because we don't have to take accountability for our actions. Whenever we daydream and drift off into Never Never Land with stuff we probably shouldn't be thinking about, whatever it is, we like to go there because it's a safe space where there's no judgment, there's no accountability, and we can just kind of be whatever we want to be. It's the Las Vegas of our mind, right? But the problem is, as the author points out, is that if you spend too much time in Vegas, you're going to be drunk, overfed, and broke. And that's basically what can happen to our minds. If we spend too much time off in fantasy land and not enough time with real commitments with real people, we're going to run the same risk. And I can speak to that as a personal struggle for me. I don't know how many of you work from home, and it was great during COVID where everybody got to be home for a little bit, and then all of a sudden everybody kind of got tired of that. And I still work from home, and I hardly see anybody outside of my immediate family unless I go to the grocery store or happen to bump into somebody when I'm out for a walk. So that can be difficult for me to try to forge those relationships, but I've really tried to push myself over the last 6 months to get out, to meet people, or to join a group, or whatever the case is. But the more real commitments we can have with real people who will hold us accountable and be truthful to us, the more we are going to grow and the more we're going to help them grow. Actionability. I really loved how easy this book is to be able to take the contents from it and go put it into practice right now. And as I've mentioned before, I think some books, whether they're self-help books or entrepreneurship books or management books or whatever, a lot of that stuff sounds really great in practice, but it can be difficult to implement on just, I stand up right now and go implement it. And I think this book does a great job with its actionability, being able to just put it into practice right away. And one of the points the author talks about is, hey, if you have young kids, right now, the season that you are in is the season to be with your kids. And that really hits home for me, because I think about, hey, I could go golf right now, or I could go to the bar with my friends or whatever, or could I be home with my family, with my daughter, spending time? And that's not to say that you can't go golfing and that you can't go to the bar and you can't do those things, because you should. You can't spend all your time at home with your family and never get out and never grow and never have real experiences. But just the idea of, hey, I'm young and single. Okay, the season I'm in is, partying and working out and taking vacations and doing all that. Hey, we're newly married. The season we're in is enjoying that time as a young couple and having fun and fixing up the house or apartment or doing whatever. Hey, I have kids. The season I'm in is being there and being dad, because eventually that's going to be gone. And when it's gone, you'll have all the time you want to play golf and drink and do whatever the hell else you want. Something else for the actionability, and this is something that I struggle with on a daily basis. The author says, if we walk around angry, that blocks our ability to be other-centered and raise above the noise of our own minds. And because of this, we can't get to the next mile marker of our life. And again, another great point, I find myself kind of sinking into the muck of my frustration and my anger, whether it's with work or if my wife and I have an argument, or if I'm not happy with the last couple of weeks of me maybe eating a balanced diet or not getting workouts in or whatever. I tend to kind of sink into that muck and just wallow in that and walk around pissed off at the world. And when that's what you're focused on, you can't raise up above the clouds to actually see what you need to be focused on. And when you can make some separation from that, and for some people it's meditation, for some people it's just getting a good night's sleep or working out or having a night with friends or family or whatever. But if we are able to separate ourselves from our anger just a little bit, it's going to give us the opportunity to see where we need to go next. And I think that's a really great point the author makes. Another thing that the author talks about that this hit me like a ton of bricks was the idea that there's no such thing as private sin. And even though we think no one else is around, no one's going to see if we're binge eating or looking at porn or gambling or drinking or doing whatever, but whatever that sin is, we end up projecting that outward towards someone else, towards our family, towards our spouses, towards our friends, towards our work, whatever. And I think that's a really good thing to be mindful of, because I've had a tendency to kind of, all right, no one's looking kind of thing. And I think I'm getting away with something, and all I'm doing is hurting myself and hurting the other people around me because I'm not the better version of myself. And eventually that frustration and realization of that is going to be projected outward in a negative fashion to those around me. So I'm hurting them. So going back to the overall theme of this book of being the keeper of your garden, what it is to be a man and masculinity in today's world, is taking care of the vulnerable and taking responsibility. And that ties directly into that, and just a really, really important message to realize and internalize and implement. Finding ways that you can be around more people, even if you're an introvert. I am an extroverted introvert. It is difficult for me to want to kind of be around new people. I think that's a lot of insecurity on my part, but I'm really trying to force myself to do that, to forge new relationships, to get new perspectives, to be around people that have different experiences than you. All of that can help you grow. You get around that stuff, you hear other people's perspectives, all of a sudden your perspective on whatever it was you're angry about or frustrated about, or maybe a hobby that you shouldn't be indulging in quite as much, all of that can help you gain perspective. My final thoughts on this book is I really, really liked it. And some people might think that it skews too close to religion. And while the book does reference God and Christianity quite a bit, and I understand that isn't for everybody, I do think the messaging, independent of religion or faith, is for everybody. The idea of taking care of the vulnerable, the idea of taking responsibility, the idea of you can't outrun your sins or your indiscretions, those are all very true things. And coupling that with you should get out more and get interacting more with real, authentic people. You should work to build relationships with people that will hold you accountable, that are authentic people. All of those messages apply to anybody, regardless of any religion or faith or association or otherwise. So instead of giving a review on the book like 2 thumbs up or 4 out of 5 stars or whatever, what I do is try to suggest who I think this book is for. And what it talks about here is the men we need. And I have a young daughter, but anybody that has children in, teenagers, college, beyond, I think this is a great book to read to help them maintain proper perspective as they step out in the world. I also think it's a great read for any parents out there, especially dads, kind of understanding where their place in the world should be. It used to be the trope of I'm the man of the house and the woman stays at home. And now the reality is the woman does everything and has to remind the husband about everything, and the husband's just kind of a bumbling idiot. And I think what needs to happen is neither of those are the way to go. The way to go is you have a partnership between the marriage, and your end is to hold yourself accountable, to be responsible, to be consistent. So when your spouse looks over and sees you, they know that they can depend on you. And I also think this book can be for anybody, as it is for me, maybe someone who feels like they kind of lost their way a little bit and they're kind of floating in the ether and they've kind of run askew of maybe the kind of person that they want to be or the kind of person that they were, which is the camp I fall into. I fall into all the camps, but especially that one. And maybe you need a little course correction and back to center. And I think this book does a great job of calling that stuff out, but doing it in a way that isn't belittling or isn't pointing the finger, but just acknowledging it and being able to help move forward. So my final thoughts on this book is I really enjoyed it. I think you should give it a read 100%. And I have a link down in the description if you would like to purchase a copy of this book. The book is The Men We Need by Brant Hansen. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode of I Hate Reading, the audio and video podcast where I help you decide whether or not you should read this book. This podcast is part of the Saturday is Dadurday Media Network, which is life advice podcasts, book review podcasts, product review videos, and cooking videos, all in due time. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time on I Hate Reading.